Hey there, readers. What's happening? This is Daniel Peña, author of the novel Bang and assistant professor at the University of Houston downtown. I just want to thank the Houston Public Library for offering me the opportunity to answer some of your questions and for choosing Bang as the book of the month for September, which is Hispanic Heritage Month. I was really touched by the questions that came in, and I was equally as touched by your readership. I say this a little bit in jest, but I also very earnestly too that I think it's a tiny miracle whenever anyone reads my stuff. Like I'm not like super famous, but also like it's we're so busy, right? Everyone is so busy, and everything is sort of demanding our time. You know, the things are big and small, are sort of like pulling at us from every direction. And so, for us to sit down and carve out time and to read, another writer's work, another, human beings, what they have to say in the world, um, that means a lot, and I'm really touched by your readership. I know you are very busy, your lives are very busy, um, and I know these are particularly intense times uh, with COVID and everything on the horizon. But this is all to say, I was so heartened by the questions, and I'm so heartened that you took time to read my book. And if you didn't, don't tell me. That's okay. You just fake it. You can just say, it was, yeah, I like the part where he flew the plane. It's like it's fine. I do that sometimes. I just came from reading right now. I had read half the book, and she's like, "How'd you like it?" And I was like, "It was, I really liked it." I just talked about it. It's sort of like when you sing really hard, that like the phrase that you know in the song, and then you just anyway. I'm diverging. Let's get your questions right. All right, cool. From Rebecca, she says, I'm curious to know more about any research or firsthand experience you have with aviation in the cities you write about in Bang. Are you from the RGV, meaning the Rio Grande Valley? I'm not from the Rio Grande Valley. I grew up in Austin. My mom is from Matamoros, and I had a lot of family in that area in Matamoros, but also in Brownsville. And so I found myself down there kind of passing through a little bit. But I'm fascinated with that corner of the world. Uh, you know, the borderlands for me don't hold as much fascination as I think maybe other Mexican American writers or other maybe even theorists. I do think of them as a special space, but I think of them as this sort of like militarized space within the American psyche, and that doesn't sort of hold over in the Mexican psyche. And so for me, that's always been a really interesting sort of line within itself, right? The way in which we militarized one border, and the way you go and it's sort of like the rest of the world moves on. And so it's always had this sort of like surveillance state uh, vibe to me that as a Mexican American, um, it's at once, you know, it's at once heavy, if that makes any sense, and at the same time beautiful because it's um, uh, a contact zone between two right cultures. Though, for if you are Mexican American, you are one and the same. I mean, you're sort of like part of that larger mestizaje, right? Um, this isn't to say that I think the borderlands should not be, uh, theorized on, or that those who theorize it on it or make it poetic in any way, uh, that's somehow not valid or something. I think it is valid. Um, but I think about this, and this is a long-winded way of getting to the research question. I think of the borderlands in our generation and in the 21st century as this space that is um, it ultimately destroys. It's the frontier of a creeping kind of fascism, and I try not to romanticize the pain of that too much. That being said, I'm fascinated by the people who make up the borderland, not their governments, right? And I think that's kind of what Bang is about. And Bang started with a central kind of question, right? With about dignity. Can you ever blame someone for trying to claim their own dignity? I thought about that a lot. Like, yeah, of course, it informs a lot of stuff with undocumented people living in this country. I have a few in my own family, but it's this sort of question too that like, is it is it a privilege to buy into the right way of doing things? Is it a privilege to be on the right side of the law. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest in the 21st century that yeah, that is a privilege, right? And it's something. It's a harsh truth that's sort of uh, prevalent within the borderlands, and I've always sort of felt that even as a I was born in the borderlands. I was born in El Paso, Texas, so not the Rio Grande Valley. But even in those spaces where I was in El Paso not too long ago. I was in Presidio uh, maybe a few months ago. That's just sort of southeast of El Paso, across from Ojinaga, Mexico. Um, and I just there's you feel it as a Mexican American. Those spaces. There are places that you are surveilled, uh, and even as a kid, that kind of pissed me off, and even as an adult, that kind of pissed me off. And so I felt like I really wanted to explore this this concept of dignity and the way in which the drug war and uh, you know migration of all stripes, um, and really America's drug war in Mexico, and um, you know all of these things are interlinked, right? Um, Inextricably interlinked, meaning they feed off each other, right? And it sort of, once you start tugging at the question of dignity and the question of these systems that make up um, these sort of like laws, I had this, like, is the drug war failed by design or by accident? And in any case, what does it say about us as a country that we keep feeding bodies to it? Um, for me, that was a really salient question. We keep deporting people to these places where they keep getting absorbed into cartels that, um, in a way, we exacerbate the problem. They become sort of prey for these recruits or prey for ransom in ways that we perpetuate the system. It's continually feeding itself. Um, and for me, that was like a really salient question that was sort of started the research and really kicked off the research. Um, and so for me, I try not to think, that was sort of the fire of it. That was the juice of it. But it wasn't really this sort of like theoretical thing so much as like, how does that manifest on a human level? Um, T.R.E. Jones, one of the great writers of our era, but was a former workshop instructor of mine. And I remember when I first embarked on the first seeds of this novel, she said something to the effect of, you got to write a story about people, uh, people and their problems. Always the people, not problems and their people. And that's kind of the book I didn't want to write. Uh, so the research really got going right when I was sort of like, I think like a lot of people, I was flying uh, really far back in must have been like 2010, 2011. I was flying these small planes around College Station, Texas, some in Houston too. But I would go north toward Mejia, which is kind of south of Dallas, and then I would go take these flights way down into the valley, right? And so that's where I got a lot of those valley flight scenes from. I remember landing at one particular airport at a place that shall go unnamed, and landing on a tarmac, and there was a right off to the side of the tarmac, there was a giant. It must have been like a DC-3 or something. It was a huge plane on about 1,000 foot, very skinny stretch of runway, and completely torn of avionics. All the stuff inside was torn out. All of the seats, all of the. It was a gutted plane. It was a drug plane, right? It was used to smuggle drugs. And for me, it was a really intriguing sight, right? The airport manager was there, and some guy looked like a government official was there, you know. And I remember landing my tiny little plane, coming off, jumping out because it takes up like three-quarters of the runway, and it was just sort of like, it began as a real interest, I guess. The novel went, so as the rubber hits the road in terms of research for the novel, it became as a really interesting curiosity as sort of like the technical aspect of how does someone land a plane like that? Um, it's a piece of piloting phenomenon. It was an incredible landing, right? But it's a very particular skill, and someone just doesn't know how to do that, right? Someone has to really practice that. Uh, and so for me, it was like there was a technical aspect to it that was sort of in piloting, and that's where the Cuauhtemoc scenes come from. And then there was that sort of literary scene, which is sort of like, what are the borderlands in the 21st century? and what are these, how, when systems fail you, how do people create their own systems? And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, if you have family in Mexico, or if you have lived in any time in Mexico, and you're familiar with the informal economy, and so that concept of creating your own system is not completely foreign, but it's an aspect of the borderlands that I feel hasn't been articulated, and it's an aspect of, no one talks about what happens to people after they're deported. We only talk about deported people, and so that was a real sort of like energizer for me too. Questioning, like, not only dignity, not only these technical aspects of who these people are that can do these things, but in which ways are we feeding the drug war with deported bodies, and what happens to those deported people after we deport them, right? To all these questions that I had. And so little by little, I was going down to Mexico quite a bit, and eventually I got like the majority of the research done in proper. And during my Fulbright, I was a Fulbrighter in Mexico City in 2014 and 2015. And at first, I was doing archive work and stuff. I was at the UNAM. I was based out of the National Autonomous University in Mexico, and I thought, this is going to be a really simple year. I'm just going to go do some archive work, look at some statistics. If you've read any of my work in the Guardian, I'm really big into numbers. I'm really big into stats and stuff. And so I was really going there for those reasons. And they had a huge drug war archive in Torre Dos, which is the Latin American and Caribbean archive. And as I was living there, Oyotzinapa had happened, where they disappeared those 43 kids, and it was like you couldn't make it up. It was a story that fell in your lap. The government colludes with cartels to disappear 43 kids, and it was a moment in my life where, Mark Twain always says, "Never let your schooling get in the way of your education." It was a moment where I had to really look up from the page and get out of the archive and look at what was happening in the street. These protests were happening, and this was exactly the thing that I was looking at. Like, how are these various systems that sort of like control and regulate who gets dignity and who doesn't, when someone tries to assert their dignity, which is what these kids were doing, right? They were on their way to a protest to really was going to commemorate the Tlatelolco massacre of, oh man, must have been 68, something like that. Forget what year it was. But Elenia Poniatowska wrote an incredible book called Noche de Tlatelolco, which is, the massacre of the night of Tlatelolco, but it was about the massacre of these students. But anyways, these students were on their way to commemorate that, and they were going to join this larger protest, and then the government disappeared them. And it was a real fundamental truth in my mind. It clicked that, if there's any kind of connective tissue between the American fabric and the Mexican one, especially thinking along the lines of the borderland, it's this fundamental truth of both fabrics, that the poorer you are and the browner you are, the more disposable you are to those fabrics. And that really resonated with me. And that's when a lot of things in the novel started clicking. Um, and yeah, so the research, it was a lot of it was archive stuff. A lot of it was my own experience as a pilot, but a lot of it came from just these questions that I couldn't find answers to, like simple answers, but that I knew I could go and seek those things out. And so I talked to a lot of journalists, talked to a lot of Mexicans, talked to a lot of, I don't talk about it a lot, but my own family was, I think like a lot of Mexican families are impacted by the drug war and the way it's manifested in Mexico. And so um, some details I didn't have to make up. Some details most of what's in the book is based on something that's true. Uh, Even San Miguel, which is a pretty gnarly place, but it's based on Praxedes de Guerrero, which is a pretty heavy town. Melissa Del Bosque, who's one of my, um, I mean, she's one of my heroes. I have a lot of admiration for her. Did a great piece on it in the Texas Observer, where she drives to the Juarez Valley and finds these places that are these hollowed out towns. Um, I never stayed any time in Praxedes de Guerrero. I passed through it a few times, and I've hung out in Ciudad Juarez a few times. But that place is based on a real place. Some of the other things, like the pajarete, for instance, or um, like the nota roja stuff. That's just from, for lack of a better explanation, that's just from being Mexican. Like that. What is a pajarete? It's just sort of like a cap full of Nescafe, a cap full of cow's milk, like fresh from the teat, and then cane alcohol that they drink in the mornings to sort of pick you up. And that's that was it was one of those things you see in a farm and you're like, I got to put that in a book. Or the way a plane feels when you're about to crash, right? Or the way the plane feels when you're sort of like when you've got everything set, all the dials are set, everything's in sync, and Cuauhtemoc can just sort of doze off, and those things come from just from me, right? And so I think there's quite a bit of, I think every author has that, quite a bit of you in the piece. I hope I answered all the aspects of that question. I'm rereading it now. So firsthand experience of aviation. Yeah, I was a pilot. I was a bad pilot. And the sites, my wife always tells me, she's like, you shouldn't say you were a bad pilot. Because I wasn't really. I wasn't like a worst pilot, but I wasn't, I'm not flying today, right? That's, I'll just say that. I'm not flying anymore. You reach a certain level of age and, you realize your own mortality and you're like, guys, what am I doing? Um, uh, All right, so the cities you write about in Bang, so yeah, and from the RGV, no. So yeah, I have a huge affinity for the RGV. Um, yeah, cool. So from Raphael, he asked, did you have concerns or reservations that depicting Mexican drug cartels, and undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. as perpetuating stereotypes? Yeah, I had that reservation quite a bit. But I also ultimately knew that if you let those stereotypes sit, you allow them to take on a center and be taken for fact. I think what's terrifying now is even though a lot of us know that you know not every Mexican is in a cartel or not every you know you always hear these negative things about Mexico and stuff, but you see it invoked as like a fact in with the president or within sort of the political rhetoric of the last 4 years. And so for me, it was really important. I do think it's important to decenter those archetypes, right? If you let them fester in a sense, you give them sort of credence, you give them a center. And so I think it's important to decenter those stereotypes. A lot of people look at Mexico and they see the Mexico, they see the news, they see the problems. But for me, and I think I try to explore this with Bang too. Um, I think I have an equally damning view of like the Texas side of the border with the pesticides and stuff as I do maybe some of the things in the Mexican side. But ultimately, I try to interrogate the way in which people move throughout the fabric of their lives. I would hope, and not in the ways in which they're sort of like these larger systems, which are a lot of times put in place by the government or by market forces. Really, people don't think of the black market is a market, but it's part of the general market is a market. Um, but I think of those things in the way in which they sort of weigh on people's lives as a lot more interesting than those stereotypes. Um, but this is all to say that yeah, I thought about this quite a bit. Like always writing about people and the problems, not problems and the people. Um, I know a lot of Mexican writers, for instance. I've gotten a lot of I have a lot of friends in Mexico who are dear to me who said, "Why would you write about this? Right? It portrays Mexico in a bad light, or it portrays a certain character in a bad light." And for me, it was almost dehumanizing not to write about it. Right? Uh, my Larry, my advisor Larry Heineman used to say, it's important to look the truth in the eye and to tell it with a straight face. Right? You have to look the truth absolutely dead in the eye and tell it, with the full authority of your voice. And for me, you have this massive thing that had taken place on the North American continent. At the time that I was publishing Bang, I think the numbers, I haven't checked them now, but it was something like 160,000, 165,000 had been killed in the war on drugs, right? In the drug war since Calderon had taken office in, I think it was 2006. And then under Peña Nieto, it kept going, the death count. And so those are like war numbers. We look at like COVID now, and we have like 211,000 deaths as of this recording. But think of how many people died, in this sort of like drug war, which was, I would argue, useless, and has done nothing but sort of like destabilize not only people's lives, but sort of like the country at large, both countries, I would argue. Um, and it was totally I think it's a racist war. It's sort of it was not a well conceived war. It's there's a lot of evidence suggests that it does more harm than good. Um, But this is all to say, like, when you're interrogating those kinds of stories, um, like it is the biggest quag. It was at one point. COVID now I think supersedes it, but it was at one point the biggest quagmire on the North American continent, right? And so for me, it was a real egregious thing not to write about it. It was almost like a lot of people from the Mexican literary fabric, um, like erased those deaths or glossed over them in some way, uh, or didn't really care about, I don't know, those stories. They were impolite realities. Let's have pleasant fictions, right? Let's create works that give hope. And I think, especially thinking along the lines of the toll it's taken on brown bodies, there's not a lot of hope I can offer in the book. It was also an opportunity to sort of like, I knew the risk was sort of like reinforcing a stereotype. Hopefully, I decentered it, but also an opportunity to really look at those things in the eye that were um, like Heinemann says, like these fundamental truths that need to be conveyed with the full authority of the voice. The fact that like it's largely women who are really patching up the sort of damage that's been inflicted uh, by people, by governments, really in this drug war. And so for me, it was an opportunity to not only just sort of interrogate uh, the interpersonal, but the sort of these macro levels in the way in which so much of the fallout of the drug war falls on women, and that labor is not cheap or easy. Um, you see it's the mothers of the Oitzinapa 43 who are demanding justice. It's the Juarez mothers, who are really demanding that the kids are found. Uh, just like it was the women, the moms in Pinochet's Chile, or demanding justice in the dirty wars of Argentina. It's a very Latin American trope, um, but it's an impolite reality. It's not a polite fiction, um, and I think some people really struggle with that. But for me, it was having gone through Ayotzinapa in Mexico City and having seen that. And I say having gone through that, I didn't go through anything, man. Um, I was just there, but it was something to witness, and it was something to watch, and I was incredibly angry um, about what had happened in the name of. And I'm a Mexican citizen in the name, in our name, in the Mexican government's. They did that in our name, right? And I think that was these things are an opportunity to sort of, I think that's the magic of literature, to unpack these things and to interrogate those harsh truths. I think that's what the best of literature does. Yeah. From Ryan. This book takes the reader on an incredible journey into the lives of a family on the US Mexico border. What do you hope your characters can offer the typical American reader, specifically those who fail to see the humanity that exists behind and sometimes within the violence and suffering caused by actions of drug cartels and government policy decisions? Yeah, I thought about this question quite a bit. And I think if I could distill it down into one thing, it would be uh, this fundamental truth, which is, I think it's a fundamental truth that when armies go head to head with markets, and I think the black market is a market, like I mentioned earlier, the market will always win. A standing army cannot defeat a market. If you send an army to destroy a cartel and you make it harder for that product to get across, that product goes up in price, and that demand does not diminish. And so if you're looking at supply and demand of a market, the market's always going to win. You just made that cartel that much richer if they can charge 3 times the price, because to get it across to the United States and then distribute in the United States, that becomes there's more incentive, right? And so it's a sort of like, you can see how all these systems sort of interfeed each other, and then we deport people, and then we just sort of like give them this vulnerable population to prey on, and it's like that across, you know, a lot of different sort of like quote unquote black market commodities. It's another thing that I want to talk about too. That you know, a lot of people say, well, let's legalize X, Y, and Z, but you realize that like these cartels are not they're not monoliths. So, it's not like you cut the head off, like you arrest Chapo Guzman and that cartel like implodes. That doesn't happen. It's not like an army, right? And I think the way in which the United States has sort of like interrogated these cartels, it's been in that sort of like, um, not only in that sort of like that jargon, right? It's a war on drugs, like, but it's been in that sort of like in their tactics as well, right? Sending standing armies uh, through the sort of School of the Americas and other mechanisms into these spaces. I'm thinking of Ciudad Juarez in particular, where they sent Mexican army with American funding and stuff into sort of quell violence in these cartels, and it was just this cluster between um, a bunch of different forces. But this is neither here nor there. The fundamental truth is that um, when you send the army head to head with these, if you chop the head off that cartel, the cartel is made up of a bunch of different cells, right? And so that cell implodes, another one opens up back up, and then that one implodes, and so it's completely decentralized. And I try to explore that a little bit with Jimmy in the book, and Cuauhtemoc. That's what Safe Home is about. That chapter where Cuauhtemoc wants to squirrel money away into Texas and with Lalo, and there's that sort of idea that we're gonna do this before the cell implodes. And that was a real phenomenon that happened it must have been 2012 or something like that, or 2000 and I think that around that time where the Juarez cartel was slowly imploding and then the Sinaloa cartel was growing. But anyways, it's not even about that stuff, right? The cartel stuff doesn't really fascinate me so much as the fact that like you know so the second thing I wanted to talk about was, these cartels are so diverse in their portfolio. Uh, it's not just drugs; it's like human smuggling, it's ransom, it's anything black market, anything you could think of, right? That you chop the head off of one of those things, or say you legalize marijuana, for instance, or say you legalize X, Y, and Z, right? Whatever it is, there's going to be some other commodity. There's always going to be some other market, and so the big question, right after, is it a right or wrong, reclaiming your dignity, is it a right or a privilege? Um, is it a privilege to stay on the right side of the law? The next thing, to the ends of like that you can never defeat this kind of market, right? Is what happens next. And I think, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, the theater of the violence of these drug wars, before it was Mexico, it was the Caribbean. Before it was the Caribbean, it was Colombia. Before it was Colombia, somewhere else, right? You're always going to have those sort of theaters of violence, right? But ultimately, it's the fallout of capitalism. Not to get too deep here, but it's a real mirror to sort of the sort of legalized violence that we experience every day within a hyper capitalist system. And so for me, that's like the thing. That's the juice of the novel. That's where it comes to questions of capitalism and dignity and the right to claim your dignity. Can you blame someone for seeking that out? Uh, and I think you can't. The systems are set up so that it's there. Capitalism by nature is winners and losers, right? I hope I answered that question. I just kind of went off on a riff there. Yeah. Um, cool. From Nicole, can you share what projects you're working on now or have planned for the future? Yeah, so I'm working on another plane book. I'm working on one about a former fighter pilot from the Syrian Air Force who burns out of the sort of the army after the Battle of Aleppo. He's a former fighter pilot who under Bashar al-Assad. Which, if you've been following what's going on in Syria, it's um it's pretty intense. It's essentially like a civil war, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. I should say a lot more complicated. But what's happening essentially is it's this pilot who finds himself refugeed in Mexico City, completely swears off of flying, and then is forced to fly again after he opens this museum of death treasures, and he accidentally collects a piece of evidence that is implicates a Mexican politician in a crime. So like he has to take off on the lam in Mexico in this like very early 20th century plane that belonged to Alberto Braniff. And so he's flying this very old Mexican plane that's important to Mexican aviation history. And it's a whole rumination. It sounds like it's going to be about aviation, like all about aviation, but really it's about these two theories of flight, which I have, which is that um, there are two modes of flight or two ways in which you really get interested in flight, I think. One is sort of the fighter pilot, the brain, the sort of the brawn and the sort of like, speed and destruction and war and that kind of thing. And there's the way in which I think most people who are interested in flight get into it, which is the kite, right? This concept of sort of just this like this floating, this butterfly. I think that's sort of like in the air, but it's not fast. It just floats. Um, and you saw early models of early 20th century airplanes. I'm thinking like the Sopwith Camel or the Wright brothers' original airplane, right? A Kitty Hawk. Those things that flew early French airplanes. They're very butterfly-like. They're very kite-like in a lot of ways. They sort of have this box structure, and you could tell there was a sort of frivolity to early flight, and then it got weaponized in World War One and World War Two, and then of course the whole jet age came, and then that was the whole thing. But it's this guy who's really breaking down not only what it means to be a dad, but what it means to be a human in really a century that's been dominated by uh, the weaponization of flight. And so I think it's his whole rumination on what flight is, and I think it has a lot to do with fatherhood, a lot to do with beauty, a lot to do with the things that make life worth living, right? Movement. The air is something that really intrigues me. Like the air is a current. The air is something that like flows, that gives lift under the wings. It's like water. It's got to move, right? There's always winds. Uh, if you read, there are sections where Cuauhtemoc is flying. He always talks about the invisible seas of the sky, and that is totally true. Like the wind dumping in off the southern chain of mountains, sort of right there in El Paso, the Rockies, I think it is, coming out of the desert and stuff. And that sort of there is an invisible ocean up there. Um, Most of us who fly commercially never get to experience that because we're flying in the substratosphere. We're flying way high, right? Something like 40,000 feet, and so there's nothing bumpy up there. You don't get to feel the ocean of the sky, but that is a thing. And if you ever get to experience it, it can be quite poetic, and very humbling. You realize you're just a speck out there. It's very humbling. I think even more so than like hanging out under like a clear sky, you know, and with the stars and stuff. And you're like, whoa, yeah. Nothing like being a small fish in a big ocean, right? Also, I'm working on a collection of essays, right? I interviewed this guy who was deported in 2016, I think it was. He was one of the first deportees under last under Obama. I think he was slated, and then the first under Trump, or one of the first, 2016, 2017, that time. And he has a kid in Georgia, and he's trying to reunite with him. Has been trying to reunite with him for like 4 years, and so it's been me following him for about 3 years now. And I've just been flying back and forth to Mexico City. Obviously, with COVID, that completely got upended. But I talked to him, and over the phone and stuff, and it's a harrowing story. But he's a Totonac Indian, which is it's a tribe. Uh, Actually, one of the tribes that helped Hernan Cortez defeat the Aztecs. They hated the Aztecs. They were arch enemies of the Aztecs. But you'll know them because they have this pole that they if you've been to sort of like central Mexico, they're the guys who jump off the pole, the voladores, the flyers, right? And they descend very slowly. And he comes from that tribe. And so it's again this sort of like meditation, and they're supposed to be birds, right? It's meditation on birds and flight, and it's called uh, uh, snapshots of a life in flight. An essay in cardinal directions. And so it's this long extended really a collection of essays in sort of using the cardinal directions of the wind, and the ways in which the zenith and the nadir, what the that means that sort of the top and the bottom, right? Um, the ways in which the Totonac indigenous people had thought of and theorized on flight. In anyways, it's kind of cool. I feel like you guys are getting me in my head. I'm thinking about like my projects now, and then I'm thinking about like all the work I got to do. This has been fun, but now I'm like, oh man, I got to work on that thing today. Speaking of which, I'm working on a thing for the Guardian. That's one thing. You can see it's going to come out in a few days now. It's on the downturn of the oil and gas industry. Nothing to do with flight, but a lot to do with masculinity. I interviewed a bunch of guys who lost their jobs, and it's like a lot of people who are affected by COVID-19. I think they're in a particularly interesting spot, and so Houston plays a huge role in that, obviously. But then also go to Louisiana. I interview some roughnecks, And so that's kind of cool. That's coming out in October 20th. So I'll send the Houston Public Library folks a link if you guys want to read that. But it's this behemoth essay. It's like 5,000 words or something like that. Cool. Well, anyways, I just want to say thank you guys for taking time to read this book. I hope I answered all your questions correctly. I do that where I go off on a rant and I'm like, but I think I got him. Anyways, I'm so grateful for you guys. I'm so grateful to the Houston Public Library. And if you guys want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is at Daniel Peña. I did that because I used to write op-eds and people get angry at me. And then so when they had to type in Twitter, like, F you, Danimal, right? It would be really funny because they would have to do something kind of cute before they yelled at me. But it's at Daniel Peña. You can reach me at dp@danielpeña.me if you want to shoot me another question. If say you asked one and I somehow didn't respond to it, or maybe you didn't ask one and you thought of something, and I'll email you. I promise I'll email you. And then danielpeña.me. That's my website. Okay, you guys be safe. You guys be good. I'll see you around the ranch. Bye.